Once again, apologies and hello and welcome to the M25's Alternative Climate Conference COP-OFF. We have an exciting new program planned for 3 days of 8 panels that are subjects at the heart of the crisis, but largely lacking from the mainstream conversations. To learn more about the program, follow the link that will come up in the chat. So, as another COP is behind us, we are faced once again with a document that fails to reflect the urgency and scale of a climate crisis, and days full of weak pledges that are likely to join the long list of broken and unrealized promises of climate conferences past. I am joined today by academics Jason Hickel and Max Ajl to discuss the past, the present of our economic systems, and how did we end up here. But first, an introduction. Jason Hickle is an economic anthropologist, author, and fellow of Royal Society of Arts and a professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, as well as visiting senior fellow at the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics. He's on the Statistical Advisory Panel of the UN Human Development Report, the Advisory Board of the Green New Deal for Europe, and Harvard-Lancet Commission on Reparation and Redistributive Justice. Jason's research focuses on global inequality, political economy, post-development, ecological economics, which are also the subjects of his two recent books, The Divide, A Brief Guide to Global Inequality and Its Solutions, and Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World. Max Ajl is an associated researcher with the Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and Environment, a postdoctoral fellow with the Rural Sociology Group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Apologies if I didn't pronounce that well. He's an associate editor at the Agrarian South and Journal of Labor and Society, and has written for the Journal of Peasant Studies and a review of African political economy. You could also have seen him in multiple outlets, including Jacobin Magazine, Viewpoint, Monthly Monthly Review, my apologies. And he has a recent book out with Pluto Press. It's called The People's Green New Deal. Jason, Max, welcome, and thank you so much for being here. So you have both worked extensively about the history and present of global inequalities and driving forces between that has behind and that has eventually led to the imbalances of today. When we talk about progress, mostly it's one of those words that has picked up a lot of baggage, and ask 10 people give you different definitions. So I would, for clarity, I would like to focus on what has been usually used by people with power and lots of status to justify policies. So economic progress, and I would like us to talk about how economic progress, as referring to the development of the global South, and in that context, how growth has been used to evolve, has been used to justify what I would like to think, I hope I'm not too optimistic, acts and actions that would be appalling, even cruel to most people. From the colonial past to post-war era, let's dissect this together. So, Max, maybe you would like to start?
Absolutely. So to contextualize these ideas of growth and development, of course, they go all the way back to the late 1800s, certainly in terms of the development of the discourse of development as a tool of British colonialism in India, and then in the interwar period as well. But they really reached full flower in terms of providing an alibi for the developmental and economic policies that the North wanted to pursue in the South and on a world scale in the aftermath of the Second World War. It suddenly became immediately normative on a world scale that you needed to carry out some form of increase in the people's access to good things. This became deeply normative, especially because in the face of the Soviet threat providing an alternative architecture for organizing society, that it was at the very least providing people's basic needs at a fairly high level of sophistication and plenitude. The dogma of progress and development then took on new form as a set of prescriptions for the South, suggesting that the South should essentially follow the same developmental path that the North had supposedly followed through the development of science, reason, technology, the evolution of a middle class, ever widening diffusion of science and technology, and this would allow for what was called the takeoff into sustained and self-sustaining growth. Of course, this was based on a widespread mythology about the course of Western industrialization and so-called development, which had actually been based on de-development, genocide, colonialism, income suppression, suppression, wide-scale deflation, massive surplus drain from the slave trade, India, Indonesia, and so forth. And so the idea that the South could actually develop in terms of the qualitative increase of the good life on a society-wide scale was in turn pure mythology that could only be used to justify continuation of accumulation on a world scale.
How much do you think that the average person is aware, since we have so many mythologies about the development of capitalism? We are often told that global South countries are just too corrupt to do good for themselves economically, then hence they must be directed by these, either by the hand of, by using debt and the hand of the IMF. But I mean, we are really, but basically what's really happening is that we're preventing these countries from using their own resources, like what you have said, to develop a middle class society. And how do you think people are aware of this? Because it's been a while now. This was probably most people were not aware of this during the Cold War, but do you think people are aware of this right now?
Sorry, is it directed to me again?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Do I think people are aware of this? Depends which people. People in the South are deeply aware of it, of course. This is why there's a strong enduring allure of anti-colonial rhetoric. In terms of people in the North, I think people are aware at different levels, different scales, and different degrees of knowledge. I mean, I don't think people are totally ignorant of it. I think there has been success in popularizing certain aspects of it in different sectors of northern populations. And of course, for example, you don't need to tell a lot of people in the United States that the slave trade contributed significantly to northern primary capital accumulation. There's a certain swath of the community in the United States that knows that very well, to take one example. There are other swaths of people in the United States who more or less know that and more or less support it, and that's why they're revanchist white supremacists who actually want a reimposition of that. You also see people who are aware of it, and this is why they advocate Malthusian population control, hardened borders, because there's an understanding that there was a process of looting and it should be sustained. And of course, this is also acknowledged at the highest level climate proceedings. Todd Stern said in 2009, we acknowledge our responsibility for the historical process of taking too much atmospheric space for carbon dioxide, but we reject actually any reparations to act upon that responsibility. So at least speaking of the United States, there's an institutionalized process of accepting responsibility, of accepting discursive, rhetorical, and performative responsibility for certain tests, so that for certain historical acts, so long as the actual prescriptions and reparations, which should logically, morally, and ethically and programmatically flow from an understanding of those facts, are rejected, right? This is kind of the artifice of American liberal hegemony, where we can understand those things so long as we do not act upon them.
And Jason, you've also, just as an academic, but also as a communicator with your books, have really tried to outline the not only the skeleton, but the everyday workings of how the hypocrisy and the double standards applied to how we talk about the global south and development and um, the North's role in it. So, would you agree with Max? Would you like to add some things you thought were missing?
Yeah, no, I do agree with Max. So, I mean, in terms of framing this historically, I think it's important to understand that that capitalist growth has always required some kind of imperial arrangement, some kind of colonization. That was very clear during the colonial period, but it remains true today, and we can discuss what that looks like. And the reason for this is simply this, right? Like when we talk about growth, we're not talking about an increase in production to meet human needs, right? Under capitalism, growth is not about use value or social provisioning or anything along those lines. Right? It's specifically about increasing commodity production, specifically commodified goods and services and commodification, in order to generate and accumulate surplus value, right? So, I mean, this is that's the sole objective. Now, in order to sustain a process of perpetual surplus accumulation, capitalism requires input prices to be as low as possible, right? So it always requires a kind of cheapening effect. Now, to achieve that, you can, this cheapening of labor and resources and other inputs that are required for the productive process, you can sabotage your own domestic base, right? Your own domestic resource base and your domestic working class, by cutting protections on labor, cutting wages, cutting environmental protections, whatever it might be. But of course, this hurts people, right? It harms communities, and sooner or later you're likely to face some kind of revolution or uprising against you, right? So in order to prevent that eventuality from, like, this contradiction from sort of realizing itself, you have to have some kind of third party whose wages and resources you can cheapen, right? Without them fighting back effectively. And this is where the colonies come in and have always served this purpose, right? And this argument is very well articulated actually by Utsa and Prabhat Putnick in several of their works. So I mean, the key thing here is that imperialism is like a structurally necessary feature of capitalist growth, right? And crucially, this arrangement was brought into question, right, in the middle of the 20th century with the rise of the radical anti-colonial movements across the global South. They succeeded in achieving political decolonization, and then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s went about a process of achieving also economic decolonization, right? Effectively reducing the reliance on northern imports and northern capital, improving wages, using tariffs and subsidies to build their own domestic industries and build a kind of economic industrial sovereignty. And it was successful. They achieved remarkable gains in human development and in economic development after several centuries of basically brutal immiseration, right? Like, and this is a crucial point. The first several hundred years of capitalist history, virtually everywhere capitalism was imposed across the world, it led to a notable decline in human welfare standards. Serial famines, genocides, massive disruption of subsistence economies, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, the idea that capitalism has somehow caused progress in social indicators is just complete nonsense. We don't see progress begin to arise until organized socialist movements and anti-colonial struggle emerges in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But anyways, yeah, so during the middle of the 20th century, you have this successful anti-colonial movement establishing economic sovereignty. And the results of this is that it poses a significant threat to capitalist growth in the core states, right? They face a crisis of stagflation, right? Like rising input costs because they no longer have access to cheap labor and raw materials in the South, and also a stagnation of economic growth. I mean, the profit mechanism begins to break down under capitalism, right, as far as capital is concerned. In order to restore the necessary mechanism for capitalist growth, they have to basically re-intervene against the global South, right? In the form first of several military interventions designed to topple these progressive independence leaders, right? So I mean, Salvador Allende is one example in Chile, but Sukarno in Indonesia, Arbenz in Guatemala, Mossadegh in Iran. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. I mean, many of the most influential leaders of the non-aligned movement from that era, from the progressive era, were toppled by Western coups, and then they were, of course, replaced. These leaders were replaced with dictators that were more amenable to Western interests, effectively re-cheapening labor and resources to restore the imperial arrangement. And that's where we're at today, right? Like the imposition of neoliberalism across the global South was not some kind of mistake. And this is the way that many progressives have come to speak of it, right? Like the imposition of neoliberalism was some kind of mistake. No, it was a necessary next stage of capitalist development. It was essential for restoring the imperial arrangement that underpins capitalist growth in the core. And this is the situation we're in today. So what's required is an effective anti-colonial struggle. And these days, of course, in the absence of progressive political class in most of the global South, this is the turf, effectively, of radical social movements across the region. And their demands are manifest very clearly in documents like the People's Agreement of Cochabamba and several other key texts, which recognize that imperial arrangements continue to exist, and that this is the major driver of both mass impoverishment across the global South, right, as well as ecological breakdown. So I think understanding ourselves is kind of in this, like towards the end of the second stage of imperialism is crucial to seeing the broader picture.
Thank you. So the climate crisis has really taken this imbalance and this history into like a whole new league. Before it was the anti-colonial struggles, and supporting anti-colonial struggles has been a call to justice and humanity and morality, or depending how you frame it. However, now and as we saw during these weeks, and the resistance coming from more vulnerable countries in the global South during the conferences, it's not only something that we should do for humanity or for betterment, or these are always loaded loaded concepts anyway, but really it's very at the heart of being able to resolve the crisis, or start to resolve at least the crisis we are facing. Unfortunately, what we're talking now amongst each other, we are kind of converted, and it's very important that this message becomes easily digestible, understandable, and even a message inspiration. Of course, the global South does not need this, but for the global North, for the people, the average worker in the global North, surely it can become very valuable. But unfortunately, we lack the platforms to explain these things. We have so much bad stereotypes, bad history to prevent us. However, since 2008, there has been more a subconscious awakening in some ways. Some people there's more and more questioning of narratives about globalization, the non-stop need for cheap labor, and the austerity, which the global South was not at all unfamiliar with the subject because of IMF and structural readjustment programs. But now that the global North has lived through austerity, do you think is there hope to speak in a way and communicate in a way that we can truly make these messages popular and even energizing people? And because maybe I'm a bit of a fool, let's say, but I mean, I certainly find it very it's like a fuel on the fire. It's there's a potential there that is amazing. So, what do you think? What should we try to do? Is there hope to communicate to a wider masses these this very complex histories and uniting struggles between the North and the South?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, yes, I think that there's possibly a shift in that direction among Western progressives, I guess. It's hard for me to say, but clearly this energy is there in the global South, and has been for several decades. Look, I think that in terms of the question of hope, it's an interesting one. You know, I mean, hope is of course important, and we need it to keep ourselves going, etc. But ultimately, like our hope can only ever be as robust as our struggle. And I think now our struggle is actually quite weak. I mean, there's been, when it comes to the question of climate breakdown, there's been a real over-reliance on our leaders to take action on this. And I think that the results of COP26 just, you know, they're a wake-up call. I mean, it's clear that asking politely for the ruling class to stop climate destruction is not going to work. And at some point we have to face up to that reality. And think of the political formations that are required to bring about the kind of radical transformation that's needed here. And I think on this front, look, on this front, I think that it's important to recognize that the environmentalist movement is not structurally capable of pulling this off alone. Okay, and I think that's clear for two reasons. And I'm talking about the environmentalist movement in the global North. The first reason is that for the most part, they do not have a sufficiently radical analysis of the problem, right? They tend to regard the problem of ecological breakdown as primarily having to do with individual behavior, individual consumer behavior, right? So we have to make personal decisions to consume less and so on. And of course, no one's denying that's important, especially for those who have the purchasing power to consume beyond what they require. But they don't, for the most part, yet recognize the structural drivers of the crisis, which is clearly capitalism, imperialism, and growthism, right? I mean, this is sort of the triad of issues here that we have to face. So you need a more structural analysis to recognize that these are the drivers of the crisis. Typically, where does this analysis come from? It comes from working class formations who tend to have like a more robust analysis of capitalism, right? The problem with working class formations in the global North right now is that they tend to line up with capital actually in calling for more growth because they see growth as necessary for improving livelihoods and jobs and employment, right? And of course, these are important objectives. Livelihoods and employments, are important objectives. As a member of labor unions for my whole life, I align with those objectives. But the point is that it's a failure of our political imagination to believe that growth is the best way to achieve that, right? It's effectively saying, let's hand the capitalist class what they want, and then hope for crumbs to fall from that table, which is not a politically acceptable, right, approach. And so, of course, there's a more direct approach that we can take, which is that there should be a demand for a shorter working week, a public job guarantee, universal basic services, living wages, et cetera, like effectively taking the question of livelihoods and employment off the table entirely, right? I mean, these social problems can be solved directly with radical policy, and so we have to be lining up behind such demands, right? Now, so this is going to require alliances between the environmentalist movement and the labor movement. This is crucial. Without this kind of alliance, it's not going to happen, right? So the environmentalist movement has to be able to line up behind demands for a social guarantee, because only once the question of livelihoods and employment is off the table can we talk seriously about scaling down unnecessary parts of the economy, right? This is what Degrowth argues. Parts of the economy that are organized around excess commodity production for the sake of corporate profit and expansion, or elite power or elite consumption, right? And it's not difficult to think of the industries or forms of production that are organized around that logic. So we have to break this logjam through something like a demand for a social guarantee, because the truth is that Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, as powerful as they are, can never pull off like the kind of coordinated strike action, for example, that would be necessary to force radical change. That's going to have to come from other kinds of political formations, such as the labor movement. So creating these alliances is literally essential, and that requires work, right? It doesn't happen on its own. It requires the hard work of mobilizing door to door, building, wall-to-wall solidarities so that you can fight against political propaganda and take power or push incumbents where necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the kind of organizing behind, say, the civil rights movement. Okay, but then the second thing that's necessary here is alliances between political formations in the global north and anti-colonial social movements in the global south. They're the ones who have the real skin in the game right now. I mean, climate apocalypse is a reality, not a distant future, but a reality for people in the South now. They're aware of that. They're organizing anti-colonial struggle in response. They realize that excess resource appropriation in the global north and energy appropriation in the global north is an act of colonization, is an act of the colonization of southern ecosystems and global commons. And they're pushing against that. These are the demands that we should be aligning with. These are the struggles we should be supporting. We should know their texts. We should support their demands. Without this kind of internationalism, I'm afraid that there's just no way to pull off the kind of coordinated action that's necessary. And I think that's essential to grasp.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to, I've been told that the chat was not working. So those who want to use the chat to ask questions, please refresh your page. Thanks. Moving on, Max, is there anything you would like to add to this before we move on from this question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think those are all critical points. I would add one more set of critical points. The reference points for Northern struggles, of course, have to be the vibrant, radical socialist, radical nationalist, anti-imperialist, popular ecology movements in the South. But people in the North and movements in the North need to accept self-determination of peoples in the South as crystallized in state institutions. In other words, the salience of the national question. And when this is always a thorny issue when it's brought up, it's always a thorny issue in particular because it's accepted in the abstract and rejected in the concrete. And this needs to be confronted head on. It can't be sidestepped. If you talk to most Northern progressives, they will say, of course, they support anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism and self-determination. If you ask them their opinion on whether or not the US should be carrying out sanctions on Zimbabwe and Nicaragua, they will be silent. Those sanctions destabilize entire societies, hit them with a hammer, allow corruption to diffuse through the entire body politic, set the stage for increased state repression of popular movements, allow for a deflection of internal struggles for popular ecology to a defense of national sovereignty, which becomes then necessary in the face of the Northern storm coming in. If Northern progressives are not prepared to take active stands in organizational and ideological defense of the self-determination of Southern states against the actual, really existing coercive measures of Northern imperialism and Northern capitalism, then it's quite impossible, I think, for us to actually have a North-South diversity, unity and diversity, and a North-South political, organizational, and mobilizational convergence, precisely because anything radically progressive that will emerge from the South will be decapitated. And I mean, I think the most telling example, specifically as it relates to the ecological movement, although I think I think that we need to protect the space even for governments that are not talking quite so openly about ecology to move in that direction. But the most blatant is the coup d'etat against the Morales government, where which elicited a widespread debate amongst Northern progressives about whether or not that was actually coup d'etat. and whether or not it reflected some sort of popular support. And finally, it was preceded by actually a discourse of ecological mismanagement, including the burning Amazon on the part of, on the supposed part of the Morales government. That was accepted. All these discourses, all these inquietudes, all these perseverations, all these worries, all these acts of sowing confusion. Insofar as that is tolerated, what is being tolerated as a consequence of the sowing of that discourse is the ideological and political disorganization of people in the North and the resultant incapacity to arrive at a North-South developmental convergence. It's colonialism and fascism by effect rather than by affect. And that needs to be confronted directly. Otherwise, otherwise we're just chatting empty words.
Yeah.
So, sorry. Please go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna talk a bit more about this. I think it's an important one, actually. If you're okay with that.
Sure.
That's fine. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah. No, I completely agree with that. I think this is so important, and crucially also because look, like to be honest, I'm not sure that right now I see the political formations in the global North being sufficiently strong to successfully demand degrowth, right? Which is clearly what has to happen. I mean, I should just preface this by saying, look, the ecological crisis is being driven by excess resource use and energy use in the global North. Degrowth is simply a call for that to be scaled down, right? And of course, we argue this can be done while at the same time improving social outcomes, just not under capitalism. Now, I mean, simply by reorganizing production around meeting human needs and well-being and ecological stability rather than around elite accumulation. Now, okay, so it's actually more likely that something like degrowth could be affected by an anti-colonial struggle from the South, okay? For this reason, because the majority of excess resource use in the global North is net appropriated from the global South, okay? The resources are taken from the South, and this is net of trade, okay, on an extraordinary scale, right? So the benefits accrue in the global North, whereas the plunder occurs in the global South. And this is an effect of unequal exchange. Unequal exchange is simply an effect also of global North states and corporations depressing the prices of labor and resources in the global South. As an effect of depressed prices, for every units of labor and resources that the South imports from the North, they have to export many more times to pay for it. This leads to a net drain of resources from South to North, right? This is what is sustaining ecological breakdown, as well as sustaining mass impoverishment in the global South, perpetuating impoverishment, okay? Those resources are therefore no longer available to be used for sovereign development, right? An anti-colonial movement that is capable of establishing economic sovereignty would effectively cut off that supply of appropriation, therefore affecting a degrowth in the global North and a reclaiming of resources to be organized around human needs in the global South. This is the outcome we want, okay? But here's the thing, which is what Max is pointing to, is that every time there are moves towards effective economic sovereignty, there is a severe backlash from global North states and corporations, sanctions, coup d'etat, et cetera, et cetera. So it's essential, as Max underlines here, that we be prepared that if we're going to call for economic sovereignty in the South and line up behind those demands, then when it actually happens, we can fight the propaganda that justifies these kinds of interventions against such movements, the thorough demonization, right? And this propaganda is extremely powerful. It is so powerful that virtually everybody in the global North was convinced that Mandela was evil, right? When he was fighting for something as basic as the end of apartheid. I mean, something fairly liberal, really. Something similar again happened in, I mean, it happens every time, but Bolivia is a good example. What are our strategies for fighting that propaganda? We have not done well on this so far. So I think that's a crucial strategy point, I think, for anti-imperialists in the global North and for socialists in the global North to consider.
Yes, thank you. the severity of the backlash is very real, and it is a big hurdle we have to overcome. As it's very, you guys really well explained very well also. And just to like even the severity of the backlash against Assange and the silence against him, for example, or just broadly in the issue of Palestine or South America, American governments and sanctions and everything, as you've said, I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, so my apologies. I'm using this session a bit selfishly, but do you think there's really, because there is like a misconception as if some people on the global north see themselves as like, because they've been like formatted to see themselves as consumers, so when they think about themselves, they're thinking global north problems like eating organic food and this and that as things they could do as consumers to help the climate question, which is we should know by now that is like kind of empty. And then they see it as a separate struggle, those struggles of the peoples of the global south. And so you, I mean, from what we've been talking about, you would agree that this would like how would you say, clearing out this fog that these are two separate issues and two separate worlds and struggles, and really understanding that the economic forces that hurt one part ends up very latently and indirectly in a lesser extent hurting the global north. And do you think communicating this would help the people in the global north? And how can we do this? Like, instead of talking about plastic straws, could we talk about how most countries in the global north haven't been able to access and use their resources to develop and their democracies to develop their own institutions and have, for example, a good waste collecting system, which ends up putting plastics in the water that ends up polluting the water? Would discourses like this be helpful or not? Would this kind of reasoning be the right way, you think? Because I'm sure there's lots of activists listening to this show.
I think we have to try it out. I don't think we know necessarily what discourse will work. And if we had an easy answer as to what discursive strategies to use, we would be using them and they would be working, right? So we don't have easy answers, of course, because these are not easy problems. But I think we can certainly push forward on certain fronts that at least seem compelling, whether or not they will be successful. And take an example that's only at a slight divergence from the one you put forward. Why is it that it's much more popular within left liberal spaces, let us say, in the North, to discuss the impact of beef rather than the impact of the US military on the world's climate system? Why is that the case, right? I mean, clearly, of course, this is appealing to an entrenched Western chauvinism, right? This is Western chauvinism is the natural kind of cultural, ideological corollary to a system of uneven accumulation on a world scale. You necessarily, the concomitant of that is an ideology that justifies the uneven accumulation of wealth, and that is consciously produced by the regnant ideological institutions, including in their allegedly progressive varieties. Right? It's natural that this ideology penetrates, including into the progressive left. Right? Now, so one, I mean, we have part of resisting it is identifying its presence in the first place. Right? We need to identify its presence and then say, put it forward. Why is there more of an emphasis on beef rather than the U.S. military? When the U.S. military, and this isn't to say, of course, clear that there's a Western overconsumption of beef. I mean, this is almost certainly the case. But The US military is probably the single most horrendous institution on a world scale over the last 70 years, right? So why is it? And why is it that people are focusing on whatever China is doing in its Western regions rather than what the US military has done on a world scale? These are not, one provides a venue for action and one does not. One provides a venue for demonization of the enemy and one does not. So we need activists and progressives to consciously resist this ideological matrix that actually serves to cleave away Northern progressive sentiment from the struggles of the South by displacing politics from the North to the South and saying the South is what needs to fix itself, rather than looking in the mirror and saying we have things to fix domestically in terms of our own ideological consciousness in order to arrive at an appropriate ideological mindset for North-South political, organizational, mobilizational, and finally developmental convergence, right? That needs to be addressed. I mean, whether or not that can actually be successful, we can have no idea, right? We cannot know. I mean, it's a Pascal's wager. I mean, we definitely need, I think, to do that in order to carry out struggles that hopefully can be successful and that can move our ecological, political, social movements together around shared demands that allow for unity and diversity and reflect the different locations from which we're entering the political field, North and South, right? Because they're not the same. Whether that can be successful is just, it's an unknowable question, right? Maybe yes, maybe no.
How about, what do you think, Jason?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, I think this is essential to attempt, especially when you consider the fact that, look, existing mainstream green discourse in the global North presupposes presupposes the continuation of several imperialist features of the world economy. In fact, their exacerbation. So, for example, let me discuss climate for a second, right? So right now, the existing discourse, of course, is that the global North should continue to grow and simply make that growth green. In terms of energy, this means trying to decarbonize as quickly as possible. Now, of course, the IPCC is clear that as long as high-income nations continue to pursue growth as usual, it's impossible for them to decarbonize fast enough to stay under 1.5 degrees, simply using the deployment of renewable energy and efficiency improvements and so on. Impossible, right? The IPCC mitigation scenarios and the politicians who follow them square that conundrum, right? They reconcile that conundrum by presupposing extraordinary quantities of negative emissions through schemes such as BECCS, right? Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Something like 80–90% of the IPCC mitigation scenarios for 1.5 and 2 degrees presuppose large quantities of negative emissions through biofuel, okay? Now, we're talking about biofuel plantations 3 times the size of India, okay? Ask yourself where those biofuel plantations are supposed to come from. Are they going to come from Finland, right? No, they're going to be appropriated from the biomass-rich regions of the global South. This is inevitable. In fact, it's in fact presupposed in the mitigation scenarios themselves that Northern energy privilege and growthism will be sustained by relying on biofuel appropriation from the global South on a mass scale, right? So leaving aside the question of whether mass negative emissions technologies are feasible at scale, which scientists, of course, say they're not, leaving aside even the ecological consequences of vast monoculture and even the famines that would be generated by appropriating agricultural land for this purpose, et cetera, et cetera. There's the colonial dimension that no one has questions. This is never questioned in the discourse of global North progressives, okay? Who continue, by the way, to promote this idea that rich countries should continue to grow the capitalist economy, despite the fact that it already uses resources and energy vastly in excess of what is required to meet human needs, even at a very high standard, right? What is going on in the progressive movement such that this is considered okay, right? This is an overt expression of relying on imperialist appropriation to support the continuation of a destructive status quo, in the global north. And the same feature is represented not only when it comes to BECCS, but also when it comes to things like, the Ezra Klein vision of electric SUVs for all, right? Like where are these materials going to come from? We know they're already appropriated from the global south under tremendously destructive ecological and social conditions, right? The idea that we can just ramp up green technology, which is materially intensive, and do so indefinitely, right? A continuation to support continued growth, relies on just this sort of easy assumption that the colonial arrangement is okay. Like, eco-socialism without an anti-imperialist lens is not eco-socialism at all. It's effectively imperial eco-fascism. It literally relies on this kind of destructive accumulation and appropriation, and dismisses the concerns, by the way, of social movements across the global south who've been pointing this problem out for several decades, right? So this is a true failure of internationalism in the global north that all of us should be significantly troubled by. And until we confront these assumptions, then this kind of easy, lazy, green colonialist ethic of Western progressives is going to continue, and it's very dangerous. It's dangerous for all of life on Earth, but it's particularly dangerous for our sisters and brothers in the South, and I think unacceptable.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. That goes well. I wanted to transition now a bit to talking about COP and also land in the global South. So again, there was long talk about carbon markets and offsetting and biofuels. Biden, I think, thanked the agribusiness heads, and land has become, I think there is a new place for land in the public conscious. However, when we talk about, as you're saying, like the craziness of an idea of like green SUVs powered by lithium or offsetting, or we'll just burn biofuels instead, as if that biofuels won't have to be grown on land. And I think, would you agree that there is a part of this comes from how we are alienated from the relations and trade, and like nobody really has a visual of the global economy, and in some aspects how ridiculous it is, like how sometimes what these long supply chains do to people in the global South, because they're always seeked out for more materials plus cheaper labor, and what it does for the planet, because it's reliant on fossil fuels to keep the chains running. But there is also a wider issue with land, even now in the global North. Cities and housing crises, northern farmers, small farmers struggling a lot, Bill Gates buying arable land all around the US. So I think there's a big space in the public conscious for this. And there was a big push in COP in this direction too. So how would you, what would your analysis be on that? And how should we be talking about the land question? Is there a way of connecting the struggles and hopefully plant the seeds for the global internationalist solidarity that is yet to really grow out of infancy?
There's space for it, but again, it's a question of molding the contours of the struggle to make sure it builds in the appropriate direction. So, and here the ideological movement, I think, is contradictory. On the one hand, there is a widespread unease, for example, with the amount of farmland that Bill Gates is buying up. And I think this reflects a kind of ambient awareness that what's being planned by him and kindred figures like Bezos and Musk and so forth is a massive monopoly control over use values, over things that people need to survive and prosper on a scale well beyond the heyday of monopoly capitalism 40 years ago. It's shifting in a qualitative sense, right? And of course, I think land makes that literally tangible in a very real way. So this is significant, and I think there is a significantly and rising interest in land, including indigenous struggles in the North. I think this reflects a certain interest and shift in the direction of the question of the importance of land and anti-colonialism, equally with the food justice movement. Again, though, I think we have to be aware of the different polarities that structure this kind of ideological shift, right? There's that on the one hand. On the other, there's still a widespread interest amongst progressives in afforestation or reforestation, for example, as a solution to the climate crisis. And then that's kind of retrofitted and stuffed into purely capitalist natural climate solutions, which you see coming from UNDP, also coming from Bill Gates. And so you see a kind of grabbing of this interest in seemingly politically ecologically just solutions based on land to the climate crisis, grabbing this kind of green sentiment and remolding it before it becomes a green-red sentiment, let alone a green-red north-south convergence sentiment, and just driving it back into the motor of what's sure to be worse than monopoly accumulation. Just will be absolute oligarchic control over the world use values, right? And I think this is, this is a function of a frequent inability to keep kind of the politics of it in command, right? So, of course, there's an enduring anti-land, anti-rural mindset, including the kind of apartheid mindset of humans being radically separate from non-human nature rather than living in comity with it. And even the ideological production of humans is separate from nature. It traces its taproots, of course, to European colonialism and rising European Christian civilization, and then the rising race consciousness, which emerged as colonialism hit its peak, right? And this is why, of course, there's such hostility traditionally to the anti-colonial national liberation movements and so forth. Why there's an enduring blindness when it comes to the land struggles of people in the third world. And of course, there's a blindness and disinterest in, of course, most radical post-Cold War distribution of land, which occurred in Zimbabwe, right? That elicited absolutely zero interest in solidarity on the part of even the radical Marxist Western. So, these things move in both directions simultaneously. What we need to do is we need to grab hold of it and say, okay, we want to build up our struggles. Yes, land is central. Yes, ecology is central. Yes, the agrarian question is central. But all of these questions need to be inserted into a framework where we're also continuing to defend national civil liberation as a conduit to North-South developmental convergence, so that the politics of it don't escape our hands like water through open fingers, right?
Okay. So, Jason, I'm just going to let you in very soon, but I think, Max, you have to leave not so late, so we enable to take questions as well. We should be trying to wrap it up.
Yeah, so do you want me to respond to the land thing as well? Is that what you're asking? Yes. Okay, yeah, gladly. So, look, I think that there's a blind spot, I think, actually, in existing climate discourse, and that's that. Well, there are several, of course. We have to actively scale down fossil fuels. Okay, cap fossil fuel use and scale it down on a binding annual schedule until the industry is virtually destroyed by the middle of the century, right? But of course, fossil fuels only account for 75% of total emissions. The rest is effectively from land. Now, and this is under conditions of industrial agriculture, almost all of it controlled by corporations. What has not yet entered our discourse is the fact that in order to reduce emissions from land use, there has to be effectively agrarian reform on a mass scale, right? A shift towards regenerative methods that is attentive to local ecology, et cetera, is not compatible with the kind of extractivism of corporate agriculture. Okay, so far from agribusiness being a kind of savior somehow, which is bizarrely is how they've been framed, and people have swallowed that pill, left eco-modernists included, right? Regenerative agriculture is going to be essential, and that's going to require land reform, even in the global north, right? Now, but the other dimension here is again has to do with unequal exchange. The existing structure of monopoly in the global food system has created the most extraordinary price compression on inputs in the global south in the form of land and land-based labor, right? And the result of that is a huge, again, net flow of embodied lands from south to north. So effectively, land embodied in traded goods, such as clothes, for example, and of course grains from south to north, which has been a feature, actually, of colonialism for the past 500 years. I mean, this is one of the most consistent features of our world economy has been the imperial appropriation of land in the global south, and it remains huge today. In fact, a colleague and I recently calculated exactly how much this net drain of land is, and it amounts to nearly 800 million hectares per year, right? To put that in perspective, that's twice the size of India. So imagine land twice the size of India that is devoted to producing goods for the global north year after year with no compensation, no like compensation in return. This is net of trade, okay? So that's land that could be used for growing nutritious food to feed local populations. It could be used for any number of purposes that would service human needs and ecology in the global south, and yet it's appropriated for the sake of sugar for Coca-Cola and cotton for Gap, et cetera, consumed in the global north, right? So here too, the land question is largely an effect of imperial forms of appropriation. That's what's driving ecological breakdown through land system change, which, by the way, is itself a crisis. We talk so much about the climate crisis, but we're overshooting several other planetary boundaries, which are at least as significant in terms of their concern. And land system change is one of those. In fact, one of the most serious forms of overshoot is in the form of land system change, driven again by industrial agriculture. So ending forms of imperial appropriation and achieving land reform, agrarian reform, is going to be essential to dealing with this dual crisis. And I think if that's not part of our discourse, and again, it's almost entirely lacking right now. I don't see it anywhere in existing progressive discourse on climate and ecology in the mainstream. And that's going to have to be redressed.
Okay, thank you for that. I guess we could pass into the questions, and I have some questions that fall in line about on the subject. So some questions from the chat is 200 years of labor movements have barely changed the dynamics of capitalism, with only decades left to deal with climate change. What hope do you have before overshoot destroys the whole system? Short answers, please. Sorry. Anybody would like to take that?
I can jump in on that. Yeah. Look, I mean, it's not entirely true that labor movements have not changed capitalism. They have. In fact, virtually every gain in terms of social outcomes or social improvements, life expectancy, infant mortality, health outcomes, et cetera, have been achieved by labor movements and socialist movements in particular. The problem is that the labor movement in the global north achieved these gains, right, which increased the cost of labor in the global north. And if this was a closed system, this would have led to a collapse of capitalism. Capitalism cannot sustain itself under conditions of social justice, right, of rising wages and full employment. It never has, and it cannot. So the effects was that they depressed wages elsewhere in the world in order to maintain the low supply price, right, to maintain the key mechanisms of capital accumulation, right? That being in the colonies or the neo-colonies. And so, and the labor movement in the global north did not recognize this or confront it adequately, okay? And as a result, we have social democracy in the global north to the extent that it even exists anymore, which is basically a compromise between a socialist labor movement and capitalism. The only way that such a compromise can be sustained is with an imperial arrangement, which we have to reject, right? And so the next stage in sort of labor consciousness for global north unions is going to have to be recognizing and rejecting the imperial arrangement. And the only conclusion is that if you want to stop imperialist appropriation and cheapening, and at the same time sustain and enable decent wages in the global north, the only possibility is a post-capitalist system. There's no other option, right? Either you accept the sabotage of the colonies or you accept the sabotage of the domestic working class. And right now we have something approximating both. So this has to be recognized and dealt with.
Oh, very good. So I'm moving on. Can anyone address GDP or GMP, which measures lots of bad things such as environmental cleanup, as growth? Well, we've already addressed this, but I think might be interesting to maybe follow up on the question of GDP being associated with bad things, as in disaster capitalism as well, but also how it's been used to justified, as we were speaking about before, to bypass certain things in the global south. So saying GDP growth correlates with high life expectancy. Hence, could we talk about that a little bit? Jason, you were talking about that a lot in your latest book. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually widely recognized among economists that GDP is a bad metric of economic progress, right? There's nothing radical about that claim, actually. You know, it's that claim has been made by people like Stiglitz and Amartya Sen and so on, and effectively kind of liberal progressive economists. GDP basically counts the market value of commodity production, but does not count any social or ecological costs of the productive process, including the labor process, or of commodification, right? And socialists should be able to recognize that the labor process is exploitative, and that commodification is not something that we want, right? I mean, processes of enclosure and privatization, et cetera, et cetera. So look, there's this strange discourse out there that GDP is sort of the main driver of improvements in social indicators and social well-being, et cetera. And this is just, I mean, there's no theoretically robust theory, argument that sustains this claim. There's no necessary relationship, of course, between aggregate commodity production, which is what GDP measures, and social outcomes. It all depends on what we're producing, okay? Education or tear gas, and whether people have access to it, right? Is the education privatized or is it publicly available? Right? And how income from production is distributed, right? So you can imagine an economy that has high GDP per capita, but is producing things that are not useful to people in terms of their well-being, you know, housing, for example, and where key goods are commodified and therefore not available to people, and where income is distributed very unequally, right? The USA is a great example. Life expectancy is declining in the USA, while GDP continues to grow. I mean, what kind of relationship is that? So we need to be more scientific about this, and I think this is crucial for socialists. Okay, we have to recognize this socialist dream that growth is somehow good is an abandonment of the political imagination, but also empirically just deeply problematic. Right? What matters for socialists, or what should matter, is use values. GDP does not measure use values. It measures exchange value. So I feel that socialists in the global north need to come to terms with some of this If they believe that more economic growth is necessary for whatever reason, then they've clearly not yet broken with the ideology of capitalism, since growthist language is ideological, the logic of commodification, and the mechanisms of imperial appropriation, given that growth relies on forms of imperial appropriation. So a better socialism is possible, is all I can say, and it requires questioning growth. That has to be crucial.
Thanks. I have a couple of questions here that are vaguely on the same subject, so I'll kind of fuse them together. I guess maybe Max, this is more, it requires a critique of eco-modernism, so I will direct it towards you. Technological developments are in large part responsible for why we are today. How do you avoid being seduced by another apparently painless technological solution? And I'm adding another question with this. Degrowth requires that we give things up. How can we be encouraged to face loss of what we are used to having, especially when in the West, successive generations have been told they can have it all?
So it's one of the critical myths of capitalism is resting not merely on the assumption of technological neutrality, but actually is an emphasis on technological innovation as a path to the promised land. This is a very basic and foundational idea linked to going back to the Industrial Revolution, and then is very deeply baked, I think, into capitalist ideology. The diffusion of technology and nationalization, rationality is what is driving this other mythological creature, social progress. Of course, this by itself is very much not the case. This then gets imported in a slightly modified form into progressive thought, where the assumption then becomes that technology is essentially neutral and that can easily be wrested from the grasp of the capitalists who make it, implement it, design it according to their own values, according to how they perceive it, it fitting, reaching their own goals, and can then be repurposed as a tool of anti-systemic, radical, revolutionary, progressive action. The first task, again, I think, is a task of kind of building up, not individually, because nothing really can be accomplished individually, but building up a kind of collective ethos within organizations, unions, spaces, fora, talks, any space that progressives are building, where the assumption should be that technology, not to assume that technology is evil, but to say technology should justify it. It should be justified. And say, okay, if you are proposing some new technological arrangement for our society, then justify it. Already when you've asked someone to justify it, you've pushed fairly far back extensively against so many of the kind of knee-jerk ideological formulations that justify the imposition of new technologies, right? Say, okay, justify vertical farms, for example. Right? Vertical farms are very compelling discourse. And then someone actually has to say, oh, wow, I'm going to have to put together technical papers and actually justify this rather than saying, okay, we can just grab it from the capitalists. And the reason this is a very powerful maneuver is because very frequently, overwhelmingly, these sorts of technologies cannot be justified. So if you run through them one by one in a serious way, and not in a way that's a YouTube ad copy for a venture capitalist firm, you find that these technologies, in fact, have no proof of concept and are not feasible and should not be the recipient of progressive energy support or legitimization. So if you look at something like vertical farms, you say, okay, actually you cannot, it doesn't actually make sense to build a farm that is going to require a great deal of metal and steel and energy and mirrors in order to redirect the solar energy, because for one thing, this is actually entropic and reverses the traditional logic of farming, which is one of gathering photosynthetic energy. For another, there's no shortage of food in the first place. There's a shortage of social power to access food, right? which is intimately linked, of course, as Jason has been pointing out, to inequality in language, right? So you actually, once you start pushing back, you have a pedagogical moment where we can actually have a discussion. Okay, there is no problem of production of food. This is Malthusian nonsense, right? There's a problem of power. That's an example. And another example is widespread discussion, including being speckled like acid onto the brains of leftists by a variety of progressive presses, considering carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture and storage is not currently feasible at scale by any means. Carbon capture and storage is a way for oil companies to continue polluting, continue burning their fixed assets, and thereby allowing them to postpone what probably will be the eventual devaluation of those assets, if in fact there wants to be, if they decide there should be some form of stopping of pouring carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And finally, is allowing for the construction of models which allow for a postponement of the arrival at zero emissions. So it actually is a service to them. And so again, once we carry out the technical task of saying justify this idea of carbon capture and storage, you see one very quickly it cannot be justified, right? You're actually, this idea that we should use a massive amount of inherently limited energy to actually draw down carbon from the atmosphere instead of actually carrying out the immediate technological transition of our energy systems to renewable energy. This by itself is a very foolhardy idea that's being aggressively pushed by the oil companies and of course by people who fancy themselves as progressives, writing in places like the New Yorker, which is of course an imperialist outlet, not exactly hospitable tradition to progressives, right? You can wonder why exactly this is the case, and you might understand that the confusion that we talk about within the progressive left is actually an artifact of a conscious process of capitalist-oriented ideological disorganization, highly profitable, right, by people who call themselves progressives. This bracket this. But the point is that once we actually dismantle the technical mythology surrounding these sorts of technologies, we then take the further step, right, of being in a position to say, actually, no, why are we discussing that instead of discussing the immediate popular deployment of renewable technology on an equitable north-south basis towards immediate developmental convergence in terms of per capita energy use? Justify why we're not doing that. And then what are people going to say? Well, we don't feel like living in a just world. Okay, well, we have different agendas. I want to live in a just world. You don't. Maybe we're not on the same side, actually.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm looking at the time, so I guess we should be wrapping up because Max, you need to leave, right? So there's more questions, but oh, would you have time for one more, or what do you think?
We can go to halfway through the hour. So
okay.
Take some questions. Another question.
Okay. So as a follow-up to that, do you think there could be, since science and so science in general, but more specifically in the context of the climate crisis, it always ends up mirroring the needs of capital because it's the financial financing process and hence the production process of science is captured within the capitalist infrastructure. Do you guys think there is a hope for a people science approach, a fund to help, a fund to maybe help peoples of the global south or people in general to have access to technology production that can address their needs in the context of the climate crisis?
Yeah, I guess I'll just very briefly say a couple of things. First is, the majority of the of the technologies we need for the transition are already available. The innovation is, of course, necessary. Innovation is driven, by the way, by human beings. It's not driven by capitalism. Capitalism simply tends to organize innovation around the interests of capital accumulation and appropriate the yields of innovation through IP laws, right? So the question of innovation is not actually a problem here. It's simply a problem of access to innovation and what are we innovating for, right? And I think this is kind of what you're after with the question of a people's science. So, I mean, the first step towards that, I think, is a radical reconsideration of IP laws. I mean, at minimum, I think it's abundantly clear to everybody, barring maybe Bill Gates, that the vaccine debacle, right, must be resolved through an immediate suspension of all IP rules that preclude developing countries, global South countries, apologies, from accessing essential medicines, right? This has been clear for decades, ever since the AIDS crisis began. So that's essential. The same thing is true for technologies related to renewable transition, right? It will not be long before this becomes a severe pinch point when it comes to the question of renewable deployments is patent licensing. Okay, so that's got to be dealt with as a matter of urgency. So at minimum, I think that these core technologies have to be decommodified from that perspective. So yeah, I guess I'll hand it over to Max since this is more his space.
Yeah, so I totally agree with that. And I think a people's technology has actually emerged in various forms over the last 70 years. The first thing to mention about people's technology is that, of course, as Jason said, technologies are coming from the people, right? I mean, research, even in an imperialist country like the US, is publicly funded. It's carried out by scientists. It's not carried out by primarily working in public research institutions. And it's the same North and South. Now, there's a problem of the people's technology needs to be, of course, reflecting the interests of people more directly rather than capital, which means a radical reorientation of research priorities. And also, there's a North-South issue, right? That's very acute. Two countries which have built up a remarkable domestic scientific research base, for example, and I don't mean to call them like people's republics by any means, but I think they're significant in terms of the North-South divide, are Iran and China, right? And these are countries that are being aggressively targeted by the United States, in part because they have started to carry out a rupture with the Northern monopoly on technology, which is a central component of uneven exchange. I think what is perhaps even more interesting about the Chinese experience, and something that is very seldom discussed, is that from 1949 to 1978, China actually carried out a remarkable problem of agricultural people science that was remarkably decentralized based on village-level experimentation, the popular diffusion of knowledge, including the popular diffusion of agricultural and agroecological knowledge, and also the popular diffusion of scientific expertise, kind of popular technological knowledge based on repair of tractors and so forth, which actually fundamentally transformed the society in many ways in terms of allowing for diffusion of this sort of people's knowledge. I think also we see a lot of people's science in various anti-systemic movements in the periphery that are seldom discussed as such, right? First of all, agriculture is a technology, right? This is something that's always skipped in these discussions. Agriculture is one of the earliest technologies, the most central technology for human flourishing in essence, right? And the agroecological movements are actually carrying out a form of people's technology. And I think we also see people's technology movements across the periphery, especially in the zone of storms that are targeted by the US. You know, if we look at Cuba, Cuba has a widespread people's technology, both high and low technology, going from agroecology to one of the most advanced biomedical installations in the global South, and in some ways also paralleling, if not rising above, the types of biomedical technology that's available in the global North. If you look at Kerala and across rural India, there are vibrant people's science movements that are part of the kind of widespread diffusion of communist consciousness in those countries. So I think, of course, all of these institutions, all of these organizations, all of these networks need to be both developed, and also in the case of the global South states, of course, we would like to see them move in a more pro-people, socialist direction in terms of the development and diffusion of their internal technological base. But it's significant that there are lots of elements both to socialize technology and and also in terms of break the North-South divide in terms of technology. I just think those gains need to be defended, but also improved upon.
Thank you. That was great. And also, I mean, I feel like, I don't know if it would be fair to note on this, but I would think so. There's also been like an assault in the last 30 years on science funding, which was mostly public, and now it's becoming more and more into mixed models, just like everything in the neoliberal era. So I can remember the Biden on the campaign trail promising to fund research and find a cure for cancer during the same speech, saying what a dream, unreasonable dream Medicare for all was. So I just couldn't help but address the different layers of ridiculousness that we have in sometimes understanding how we produce science, we produce technologies based on that science, and who has access and can benefit on those. So that's great. Thank you so much for your replies. Would an agrarian reform towards agroecology and smaller farms necessitate a change of diets? Could cheap and mass-produced beef and other meats be maintained in such reform?
I think this one's for me, and then we give the last question to Jason. I think overwhelmingly the evidence points towards large reductions in northern production and consumption of meat in widespread agrarian reform and an agroecological transition of northern diets. I don't think that's certain. I think it's quite likely, and that is because a lot of you can't sustainably feed cattle all these corn and other cereal crops, and it's the same with chicken and pigs and so forth. They produce massive ecological harms. This is less applicable to the South, although there are certain dietary transitions taking place in China around pigs and so forth that are also beginning to butt up against certain ecological limits. So, of course, we need to ecologically and socially modulate widespread meat consumption. I think it's very clear. And make sure that meat consumption, like everything that is produced one in a way that is attentive to distributional consequences, in other words, socialism, and that two is attentive to nestling human production into the biosphere, in other words, eco-socialism. That will accordingly, I think, entail substantial reductions, certainly of beef and poultry production and consumption in the United States and Europe. Probably it does not apply in the same way to the rest of the global South. And I think that certainly the issue needs more research in terms of what kind of production and consumption is sustainable on a permanent basis. I encourage people to check out Ian Schoon's work, who recently produced a report on pastoralism that grounds the debate in the state-of-the-art scientific research and about the differences in northern and southern meat production and consumption, so people can get up to speed on the latest scientific evidence and learn for themselves about what the state of the debate is.
Jason, would you like to add in the last 2 minutes something?
On the question of beef, Max is the expert there, so I'm going to leave that. But I did notice there was which I can just address very briefly, there was a question in the chat about how production should be organized in a socialist economy, such that it would not just continue to pursue growth. I think the first thing to understand here is that when we say growth and we mean GDP growth, that is a capitalist metric, right? That it measures exchange value. So it's not even clear to me that a socialist economy would want to pursue GDP growth. Like it becomes a kind of like a real socialist economy, this would be a kind of nonsensical objective. Why would you want to maximize exchange value, which of course entails a kind of surplus value appropriation, right? That's not the objective we would want. So what you want to do is you want to organize production around meeting human needs. So you need some kind of theory of human needs for this to make any sense. But there is that we know that capitalist growth depends on a couple of key features. The first is it depends on a pool of unemployed labor, and it depends on enclosure, right? The enclosure of access to basic goods has to be somehow privatized or prevented. Okay, when we call for the de-enclosure of the core social economy, healthcare, education, housing, water, energy, internets, etc. And when we call for full employment or something like a basic income that would take the question of livelihoods off the table, this eliminates the very possibility of capitalism. Capitalism cannot sustain itself under conditions of abundance like this. And so it would lead to a massive disaccumulation of capital. And therefore, growth imperatives would be eliminated from the economy because it's overaccumulation of capital that leads to growth imperatives, right? So you hit the growth imperative from two sides. One is through de-enclosure and one is through disaccumulation. I don't see how capitalism can function under conditions of de-enclosure and disaccumulation. I think that by de facto creates the conditions for an eco-social economy. It's actually not rocket science, right? To the extent that capitalism arose through enclosure and accumulation, it dies through de-enclosure and disaccumulation. Simple as that. So in such an economy, I don't think growth is a possibility as such in the capitalist sense. We may, however, choose to increase production for the sake of meeting some specific human need or use value, right? Which is, in fact, precisely what the post-independence governments in the global South sought to do. That was their objective in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So that's the kind of ethic we need to retain versus growthism.
That was excellent. Thank you both so much for giving us like 1.5 hours of your time. I hope our viewers enjoyed this as much as I did, and it was really nice. I'm very happy with how many different points we got to hit, and I think lots of blind spots has been revealed, and I hopefully this will be useful for our audiences. Thank you so much again, Jason, Max. This has been great.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Defne.